My sister-in-law and her husband. The sloth who plays video games all day wants my house. But this doesn't end well for them when they do something to my dog. My in-laws have a very toxic relationship with my husband, and it's starting to affect my life. You see, while growing up, my husband used to be the favorite, the golden child, and his mother was extremely close to him. Jacob has told me that because his father used to be quite busy with work, his mother and he spent a lot of time together. But I've noticed that his sister, Sarah, is not treated the same way by my mother-in-law. Although I'm sure my mother-in-law loves both of her children, I have noticed time and again that she favors my husband more. I am sure my sister-in-law must have felt this while growing up, so my husband has always tried to fill the role of being a good older brother to her and always being there for her. But the truth is that both my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law sometimes behave so absurdly that they cross the line. For example, when Jacob and I started dating, he was still a fresh university graduate at that time, and my in-laws, including Sarah, used to live in the same house. My in-laws had given my husband a completely different floor so that he could have his own privacy and invite whoever he wanted. That's why sometimes he would invite me over to his house to spend the night with him. However, on several occasions in the morning, my sister-in-law would enter our room while we were sleeping without knocking. As you can imagine, sometimes we were not even dressed properly, but she acted as if it was completely normal and started talking to Jacob about very random things. This was extremely strange for me as I felt uncomfortable with her seeing me in my underwear. Before anyone points it out, I completely understand that Jacob was living with his family at that time, so I should have expected this, but is knocking on the door before entering a room really too much to ask? I guess sometimes siblings can be very close, but she and I did not know each other very well when Jacob and I started dating, so I found her behavior extremely disrespectful. Naturally, I talked to Jacob about it and told him that I would not come over again unless he put a lock on the door. He agreed, but as you can imagine, my sister-in-law tried to barge in the next morning unsuccessfully and began shouting at us about why we had locked the door. She started shaking the door and banging on it, asking her brother to let her in. Finally, Jacob let her in, and she came into the room furious, questioning why he had installed the lock in the first place. When she noticed me, she pointed at me and started yelling at him, "It's because of this woman." I was stunned to hear how rude and disrespectful she sounded. Jacob told her that he was the one who wanted to install the lock on the door, but my sister-in-law was not convinced. Angrily, she told him that they were siblings and shouldn't have secrets between them. Jacob told her that he had no secrets and had installed the lock so she wouldn't barge in while he and I were sleeping, as it was really disturbing. Upon hearing this, my sister-in-law turned her head towards me and screamed that it was all my fault and that I was coming between her and her brother. All this felt too much for me, as I am very non-confrontational, so I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I could hear her continuing to shout and Jacob trying to calm her down. When she finally left, he came to comfort me, apologized for her behavior, and assured me that he would talk to her again so that she would also apologize to me. The following weekend when I went over, she did apologize to me and gave a very pathetic excuse that she needed to talk to Jacob urgently about something and thought it would be okay to enter. Jacob firmly asked her not to bother us again, and she timidly nodded. Although this issue was resolved, this was not her only weird behavior towards Jacob. If Jacob and I disagreed on something, even small things like movies, and if my sister-in-law was around, she would start telling him how he should date someone who had similar tastes to his and that we clearly weren't right for each other. Jacob would give her a disapproving look, but she would just smile. Another incident was when she would ask me uncomfortable questions about my past, trying to pry into my life. Jacob and I had been honest about each other's pasts from the beginning, but I did not feel comfortable sharing it with his sister. But despite my feelings, she would ask me uncomfortable questions like, "Why did your ex break up with you? Were you not good enough for him?" Or make comments like, "My brother's ex-girlfriend was much prettier than you." All these questions and comments happened when she and I were alone. I slowly started to suspect that she was trying to play this game with me and belittle me. Initially, I kept quiet, but after several days of her continuing, one day I had enough. I responded to her taunt by saying how I preferred my ex-boyfriend's family over Jacob's family since my ex-boyfriend didn't have nosy and domineering relatives. My sister-in-law seemed taken aback by my response, and this silenced her for a while. What I said was basically true. Although my sister-in-law had a strange relationship with my husband, my mother-in-law was no better than her. When I first entered their lives, my mother-in-law ignored me, but once she realized Jacob and I were serious, she started behaving as if I was trying to steal her son. She purposely ignored me at dinner or during family gatherings and acted as if I didn't exist. Sometimes Jacob would notice this and try to talk to her about it, but she never changed. My mother-in-law even once called me stuck-up and spoiled just because my parents sent me to a private school, and she was a public school teacher. I even know that she tried to convince Jacob not to marry me and told him to keep looking for a better partner than me. Fortunately, my husband didn't care about her opinion and proposed to me anyway. When my mother-in-law and sister-in-law found out he proposed to me, they went ballistic. Both called me, telling me that maybe this was a bad decision and, since Jacob wouldn't listen to them, I should break up with him and return the ring. I found it very strange and refused, telling them they were crossing a line by asking something like that when I loved Jacob and wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. When they realized they couldn't convince me, my mother-in-law grudgingly changed her tone and told me I should strive to be the best wife for him and take care of him the same way she had taken care of him all these years. I felt a bit offended but tried not to get too upset by her words. Sarah, on the other hand, told me that I was clearly just a gold digger and that her brother deserved someone of his status, which was funny because, at one moment, it was a problem that I went to private schools and the next that I wasn't of enough status for him. She was unbalanced. She threatened to make sure to expose me before our wedding so Jacob would never marry me. After this conversation, I immediately talked to Jacob about everything, and he was shocked at how rude they had been to me. He argued with them over this, but both my mother-in-law and sister-in-law stood firm in their opinion that I wasn't good enough for him. He told me to ignore them and that he loved me regardless of what they thought. Although his words were comforting, I felt bad that his own family didn't accept me. Jacob and I had already decided to pay for our own wedding, so when my mother-in-law offered to pay for half of our expenses, we politely declined, with Jacob telling her how hard we had worked to save money just for this occasion. Instead of being happy for us, this made her even more upset and began telling Jacob how sad she was that he didn't need her anymore. But Jacob's father seemed very proud of us. Unlike his sister and mother, his father was quite laid back and never had any issues with our relationship. Since my mother-in-law kept complaining to Jacob, we reached a compromise, telling her that we would love for her to host the rehearsal dinner for us. She agreed, and we tried to let that bring peace. However, as the wedding approached, things took an unexpected turn. The first incident was when my sister-in-law invited herself over for dinner, telling Jacob how much she missed him. By that time, Jacob and I were already living alone after our engagement, so we thought she genuinely wanted to spend time with her brother, so we agreed. Jacob asked me clearly if it was okay to have dinner with her, and I reluctantly agreed as I did not want to be rude to my sister-in-law, who was soon going to be part of my family. While having a nice meal, my sister-in-law, apparently out of nowhere, started talking about how she absolutely detested cheating couples and how cheaters were worth nothing. We looked at her curiously, wondering where she was going with this. That's when my sister-in-law looked directly at my face and asked how it felt to be worth nothing. My eyebrows furrowed in confusion, and then my sister-in-law began shouting, accusing me of having an affair with my co-worker, Zach. Jacob asked her what she meant by that, and my sister-in-law began triumphantly pulling out photos of me with one of my co-workers, waving them around and insisting that she had caught me red-handed. I already knew that I had never cheated on Jacob since we started dating, so I was also curious as to why she thought I was having an affair with my co-worker. Looking at the photos, they seemed pretty harmless. It's true that Zach and I were close co-workers, but only because we both started at the company at the same time and helped each other out whenever we made mistakes so our boss wouldn't reprimand us later. Zach even had a girlfriend, and Jacob knew it. I didn't have a lock on my phone and had always been quite frank with Jacob about all my co-workers. These casual moments captured in the photos were misconstrued by my sister-in-law into something they weren't evidence of a fictitious affair. In reality, it was far from her baseless accusations, and I felt a surge of annoyance at her attempts to tarnish my integrity and strain my relationship with Jacob. Before I could speak up to defend myself, Jacob, shocked and visibly upset, stepped in for me. He asked my sister-in-law why she was following me around and taking pictures with my co-workers in various public places without anyone's consent. My sister-in-law, hearing this, began to justify that she only wanted to investigate me since I wasn't of her status and feared I was marrying him to take his money. Jacob firmly told her that her claims were baseless and that she was creating unnecessary drama out of nothing. He tried reasoning with her, asking her to stop spreading lies and trying to harm our relationship. But my sister-in-law continued yelling that he should open his eyes to the obvious affair happening. I also tried to tell her that we were just co-workers, but she clung to her assertions vehemently. The atmosphere became tense as her accusations escalated. I had had enough of her accusations and yelling, so I told my sister-in-law that I was going to file a police report against her for taking my photos illegally and stalking me. Her expression froze as she stared at me, asking if I was serious. I told her I clearly had all the evidence and that she had intentionally followed and taken these photos of me with my co-workers without my consent and was trying to defame me with ridiculous lies. My sister-in-law asked what I wanted, and I told her I wouldn't file a report against her as long as she stayed out of my life. At this point, there was nothing my sister-in-law could do to escape this situation. She looked at her brother, but Jacob backed me up, telling her she should be grateful that I was willing to let it go since what she did was clearly wrong. She reluctantly agreed to stay away from me, and since that day, she and I haven't spoken. Jacob still has a relationship with her but never dared to talk to me again after that. Now, the second incident before our wedding was just the night before during our rehearsal dinner. My mother-in-law, who had insisted on taking responsibility for our rehearsal dinner, declined our offer to help her in any way before the event and told us she would handle it. However, upon arrival, it was clear that the preparations were not as expected. The rehearsal dinner turned out to be a collection of plastic tablecloths on picnic tables and cold Mexican food. During the dinner, she kept acting annoyed, which made the entire celebration feel a bit awkward. She got drunk and started behaving inappropriately with the other guests, saying she couldn't wait for the wedding stuff to be over and how stressful it had been, even though she didn't contribute financially or to the planning. Eventually, my father-in-law also got angry and took her away. My sister-in-law tried to protest, trying to justify her mother's behavior, but my father-in-law refused to listen to her. As you can imagine, it was a complete disaster, and I started to panic, thinking these two women would somehow ruin my wedding the next day. That night Jacob and I had our first fight. I firmly told him he needed to uninvite both his sister and his mother since clearly, with the way they were behaving, they would definitely do something to overshadow us during the wedding. My husband vehemently refused, trying to reassure me that his father would be there and wouldn't let them get away with it. So I had to threaten Jacob that if he didn't uninvite his mother and sister, there wouldn't be a wedding the next day. Jacob was visibly shocked by my demand as he knew exactly how it sounded, but I was anxious thinking about what these women would be up to. I didn't want to be embarrassed again in front of my family and friends on my wedding day. Jacob clearly didn't have solid boundaries, but I hoped that with this last decision, he would understand how much they were starting to affect our relationship. Thankfully, Jacob understood and made the right decision. He called his father early in the morning and informed him that his mother and sister were uninvited. My father-in-law didn't even seem surprised and assured us he would make sure my mother-in-law and sister-in-law didn't show up uninvited. After a few moments of our conversation with my father-in-law, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law started calling Jacob continuously, clearly to convince him to let them come to his wedding. But Jacob firmly told them that after how they had behaved with me during our relationship, he didn't feel comfortable having them during the wedding. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law started saying how awful I was for coming between him and his mother. My sister-in-law also tried reasoning with him, but Jacob stood firm in his decision. I felt bad that my father-in-law couldn't come to our wedding because of his wife and daughter, and believe me, I felt horrible for my ultimatum. But all my feelings of guilt went down the drain when I later found out from some of Jacob's cousins that my sister-in-law and mother-in-law had planned to wear white dresses to our wedding. They told me how they had a family WhatsApp group where only female members were, and in this group, my sister-in-law encouraged others to wear white dresses too, saying there was no reason the bride should be the only one wearing white. I was stunned by how low they could go to hurt me. After finding this out, I was glad they had been uninvited. Jacob missed his family but also understood where I was coming from. Overall, we had a great wedding, and no one tried to overshadow us. But since that day, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law have stopped talking to me completely, which I was very happy about and was perfectly comfortable with. They only invited my husband for dinner or on special occasions, which didn't bother me too much. My father-in-law, on the other hand, was kind to me, and we stayed in touch. Over the years, Jacob and I meticulously saved our money and eventually bought a new house. This year is our first house, and as you can imagine, we were very excited to finally own something so big. His parents and my sister-in-law came to visit our place for a small housewarming celebration. That day, to avoid them, I visited my parents and spent time with my family. Now coming to the main issue. Last month, out of the blue, my mother-in-law called me. This was very unexpected as she and I had never spoken since the day I married Jacob. Surprisingly, she casually asked how I had been and how my life was going. I was a bit taken aback by her sudden interest but answered her questions anyway. She then started asking how it felt to live in such a big house when it was just Jacob and me. Her words hurt because Jacob and I had been trying for a long time to get pregnant, but due to some fertility issues, I couldn't get pregnant. Jacob knew this, and although we lamented that we might never have our own children, we eventually accepted it. He loved me and told me it was okay not to have children as long as we had each other. Obviously, our families knew this too, so my mother-in-law made subtle comments about it. She then continued to inform me that my sister-in-law was pregnant. I was shocked to hear this as this was going to be her 6th child. I had heard from Jacob that her husband was jobless and didn't believe in using condoms, which led to these accidental pregnancies. My sister-in-law's partner was the epitome of laziness and did nothing in the house to help her or the kids. I've heard from Jacob that he treats my sister-in-law like his personal maid. He doesn't even pay the house bills. My sister-in-law works several part-time jobs while he plays video games all day. Despite how much everyone has talked to her, my sister-in-law never leaves him. My mother-in-law then continued saying that since my sister-in-law couldn't afford to keep working during her pregnancy, she thought it would be a good idea for Jacob and me to give up our place since it was too big for a childless couple like us. I was stunned by her demand and struggled to find words. I asked her if she was joking, but my mother-in-law continued saying that she was very serious and that my sister-in-law and her husband deserved to live in a bigger house. But since she didn't have space in her own house to let them move in, she had asked them to move in with us. The weight of this announcement hung in the air, and I found myself trying to compose a response amid the whirlwind of emotions now enveloping me. I explained how this was our house that we were still paying for, and the idea of someone else moving in with us so abruptly without even asking our permission was intrusive and ridiculous. However, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law emphasized that they had already talked to Jacob and that he had agreed to this. This seemed strange as Jacob and I always shared everything between us, and I knew for sure that he would have definitely told me the news if he had agreed to let his sister and her family stay with us. I told my mother-in-law firmly that since the house was both mine and Jacob's, he couldn't give permission alone without my consent. No one could live here with us unless we both agreed. To compromise, I said I would be happy to host my sister-in-law and her husband for a few days if that's what they wanted, but I wouldn't allow them to move in with us. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, started shouting at me that making room for my sister-in-law and her husband was expected of me as a dutiful daughter-in-law and that if I agreed to her demands, all our past issues would be forgiven. So I angrily responded, "Sure, I'll be happy to let them have our home, but look, we are still paying for this place, and I know if my sister-in-law and her husband move in, they won't help us with the mortgage or bills. So, therefore, I think you should take some responsibility and help pay for my sister-in-law, her husband, and their kids to live in our house. I'll be happy if you can pay just the mortgage for us, and we can cover everyone's bills. I know you won't be able to pay the mortgage with the only job you have, so tell me when you're going to get a second job to pay the debt." My mother-in-law, hearing this, exploded in a fit of rage, screaming and expressing her discontent. She told me it was ridiculous for me to ask her to pay the mortgage for us, and I responded that it was equally ridiculous for her to expect us to take care of my sister-in-law's family and let them move in. This enraged her even more, and she continued yelling while I smiled in satisfaction. She hung up the call when she realized I wasn't going to give in to her demands. Shortly after, my sister-in-law called, screaming at me for daring to ask her mother to pay our mortgage. She continued saying how she had always known I was just a gold digger. I told her that she was the gold digger for trying to live with us, and if she ever wanted to see who the real gold digger in the family was, she needed to look at her own partner, who did nothing to help her. This seemed to shut her up. I told her firmly that she could argue with me all she wanted, but I would never allow her family to move into our house unless they were willing to help us with our mortgage. She accused me of being ruthless and prioritizing money over family. Update 1. Thank you to everyone who has supported me. To answer the most important question everyone keeps asking, why would my mother-in-law demand something so ridiculous from us? It's because my mother-in-law has always been this arrogant. Clearly, my husband has let this charade go on for too long, and he and I need to sit down and have a serious conversation about it. It's pathetic how my mother-in-law can lie about her own son just to get her way. My sister-in-law is just a pawn in her game, doing what her mom wants because my mother-in-law has always favored my husband a lot. My sister-in-law just follows what her mom says, hoping my mother-in-law will favor her too. In this case, my sister-in-law would benefit from this situation as she could depend on us to pay her bills and take care of her kids while her useless husband does nothing. I'm waiting for my husband to return from his business trip so we can talk. I don't want to discuss this over the phone with him as it's too important. Update 2. It's been 3 days since my last update. As I mentioned earlier, I was waiting for my husband to return so we could finally sit down and talk. When he came back and we finally could talk, I told him about how his mother had called me, demanding that we give up our house for his sister and her family. Jacob was clearly shocked to hear this and continued telling him the entire story. He then confessed that he had no idea about any of this and that the only thing his mother had told him before he left for his trip was that his sister was pregnant. That was all he knew about the situation, and he had no idea she would make such ridiculous demands. I told him firmly that I expected him to talk to my mother-in-law about it and handle the situation since I couldn't deal with his family. He agreed. He called my mother-in-law in front of me and asked why she had lied to me about him. Caught in her lie, my mother-in-law tried to backtrack, saying she hadn't exactly lied and that she knew he wouldn't have any problem with his sister living with us, so she had decided to take matters into her own hands and ask me directly. Jacob stopped her and asked why she assumed he wouldn't have any problem with his sister and her entire family moving in. My mother-in-law told him that since he and his sister were close, that obviously meant he would be happy to help her by letting her family move in. Hearing this, I closed my eyes in frustration but kept my mouth shut as Jacob needed to handle his mother. My husband then told her firmly that there was no way he would let my sister-in-law, her unemployed husband, and their 6 kids move in with us and that she had no right to force us to take them in. My mother-in-law started yelling that my sister-in-law really needed someone right now. But my husband told her it wasn't our responsibility and that if she wanted, she should take care of my sister-in-law. She then started saying that my father-in-law didn't want that and that their house was too small, but we were living in such a huge house, so we could easily help her. She even went on to say that since I was sterile anyway, I could help my sister-in-law's kids, and that would make me feel fulfilled. My eyes widened in shock, but for the first time, I saw my husband's face change color. He yelled at her that she had no right to say something so insensitive about me and couldn't use that against me to force me to take care of my sister-in-law's kids. He continued saying that my father-in-law was right in not wanting anything to do with my sister-in-law since she had become a baby-making machine and he was done with both of them. My mother-in-law tried to backtrack, but Jacob continued yelling that this was our house and I was his wife and anyone who disrespected me was also disrespecting him and didn't deserve to stay in his life. With those final words, Jacob cut the call. Since then, he has had no contact with my sister-in-law or mother-in-law. My father-in-law did call to talk to him, but after learning about the entire incident, he understood exactly why Jacob had made such a drastic decision. My father-in-law spoke and apologized to me on behalf of his wife, but I told him it wasn't his fault anyway. Update 3. It has been an interesting few weeks. Many people suggested that I install cameras around my house in case my mother-in-law and sister-in-law decided to show up and cause a scene, so I did. I ordered them online and installed several around my home. Well, luckily, they decided to show up last weekend, banging on my door while I was completely alone. When I saw they were there from my camera, I immediately called Jacob, and he said he was on his way. When I opened the door, there were my mother-in-law and sister-in-law staring at me furiously. They demanded I let them in, but I stood my ground, refusing to let them in and telling them if they had anything to say, they could do it from outside. My mother-in-law began yelling about how heartless I was, accusing me of being greedy and selfish. I calmly told her this was our house, and they had no right to barge in uninvited. My mother-in-law continued, not realizing that the cameras were capturing every moment. I calmly reminded her of our previous conversation, reiterating that I would not give up my home for my sister-in-law and her husband, and if she had anything else to say, she should wait for Jacob to come home. My sister-in-law, on the other hand, began screaming that I was tearing the family apart for no reason and was being too stubborn. She called me not just a gold digger as she always knew I was, but now trying to alienate her brother from them. I then informed them that everything they were saying was being recorded on our cameras and that I would use this evidence to get a restraining order against them so next time they wouldn't be able to come within 100 meters of our house. Their eyes widened in shock, and my mother-in-law screamed that I wouldn't dare do that. I smiled maliciously and told her that if they didn't leave our property right at that moment, she would receive a legal order very soon. This scared them, and my sister-in-law began saying I was overreacting and that it wasn't a big deal. Luckily at that moment, Jacob arrived. He calmly approached us and asked my mother-in-law what they were doing there. My mother-in-law ran to hug him, but he dodged her and asked them again firmly what they were doing there. My sister-in-law began saying that they knew it was me trying to control his life by not letting him talk to them and that they had come to confront me. I rolled my eyes at how absurd they both sounded. Jacob clarified to both of them that it was his decision to cut contact and that he didn't want to have anything to do with either of them. My mother-in-law began begging him at this point to forgive her, but he simply asked them to leave the property or he wouldn't have any choice but to call the police. Their eyes widened in shock. Clearly, neither had expected this reaction from him. Jacob continued telling them that if they ever showed up at our house again, then we would be free to call the police and have them removed by force. They looked devastated, but Jacob didn't care anymore. I felt relieved that my husband was finally standing up for me. Eventually, they both left, still furious. Since then, Jacob has also talked to my father-in-law, who was as shocked as we were that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law had gone behind our backs to show up at our house unannounced. He assured us we did the right thing by not letting them in, and he was also getting increasingly frustrated with their behavior. I know with Jacob being so firm about it and throwing them out, they won't dare set foot on our property again. If they do, well, I'll contact a lawyer and have a restraining order sent immediately. I'm glad my husband has finally realized how toxic his family is, and I hope they don't bother us anymore so we can live our lives in peace. I hope this is my last update, as I also want to move on from this situation. Update 4. I hoped my last update would be final, but unfortunately, it wasn't. I have a lot to tell. Jacob and I went on vacation a few weeks ago, and while we were away from home, my sister-in-law broke into our house. They basically broke a window at the back and then changed the locks and everything. We didn't have an alarm per se, but we did have the cameras we had installed. We had left our dog with one of those systems that fill the food and water bowls every so often, and a friend visited every other day to check on him. That's why I decided to check on him using the cameras on my phone. My heart raced when I saw my sister-in-law and her kids along with her husband, who was playing video games in my living room in his underwear. The worst part was I didn't see my dog because they had kicked him out. He had a back door to do his business in the backyard, but they let him out the front, and he left, not before being mistreated so he would leave. So I showed Jacob, and we decided to end our vacation early. The trip was about 5 hours, but an hour before we arrived, we called the police. By the time we arrived, there were a couple of patrol cars at the door talking to my sister-in-law. We immediately explained that it was our house and that these people had no right to be there. So one of the officers called Child Protection Services, and they took the kids away while my sister-in-law and her husband were arrested. In all that time, which lasted several hours, my mother-in-law appeared. I began to review earlier recordings from the security cameras and saw that she had also been there the day before with them. So the police also arrested her because they considered her an accomplice. In summary, they didn't spend much time in jail, but we are thinking of taking legal action against them, first restraining orders, then some lawsuit for damages since they changed the locks, broke some things inside, and also made us lose some hotel days on our vacation. I'll come back when I have more news about all this, though it won't be soon. Update 5. Well, the restraining orders are ready, and they can't get closer than 100 meters to us and the house. They also lost a lawsuit for $7,500 for damages and other issues that my sister-in-law and her husband have to pay. But since they don't have much, they'll probably ask my mother-in-law for help. Many asked about my dog in the last update since I didn't comment on what happened with him. Luckily, he just went to a neighbor's house who took care of him until we got home. He was just a little scared by how they had treated him to get him to leave, but that was all. He was very happy to see us. My father-in-law is also tired of my mother-in-law, so he is thinking of getting a divorce. But whether that happens or not is none of my business, so I don't think I'll update you on that.